the book emerged as I was dealing with people who had gone through the Rwandan genocide and whose lives were deeply touched by that, and people who had been through the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, and people who had been through tremendously challenging situations, and who themselves had been deeply hurt and traumatized. And part of what this represents is a journey with people who have suffered.
Why knowledge matters. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Professor Emeritus Vern Neufeld Redekop. Vern, such a pleasure to have you back here on the show, finally.
It's always a pleasure talking with you.
And this episode is really special because it's about your book, which is very dear to you, called From Violence to Blessing.
I've got it right here.
Exactly. And I also have it behind me because it's such a thorough book. It's such a pleasure. And the more I read it, the more relevant it really becomes, even in this really crazy world to some extent we live in today. And therefore, I'm so grateful to you for this great work. Now, let's provide us an overview of the central theme and message of From Violence to Blessing.
Well, first of all, I want to say that this whole endeavor about trying to bring out the essence of my work, pass it on to others, and so on, has to be put in the context of a community. It's not about me, it's about we, about us. Because we're all in this human condition together. And as I wrote the book and did the research behind it, initially I thought I'm going to talk about the big conflicts out there and figure out how we can do something about it. And then the more I got into it, I figured this is about me, understanding myself. And we're all needing to understand ourselves and where we are in relation to deep-rooted conflict. The other thing I want to say about the we nature of this is that the book was written and the research was done in conversation with others, and in conversation metaphorically with a whole lot of other authors. And I stand on the shoulders of intellectual giants and human giants who have done so much for humankind, and giants in terms of their personal engagement, because the book emerged as I was dealing with people who had gone through the Rwandan genocide and whose lives were deeply touched by that, and people who had been through the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, and people who had been through tremendously challenging situations, and who themselves had been deeply hurt and traumatized. And part of what this represents is a journey with people who have suffered, as well as an attempt to get a feel for what drives perpetrators. And in certain instances, the perpetrators are doing things in response to their own hurts. And one of the most touching things for me was when somebody who had been through the Rwandan genocide, or whose family had been pretty much eliminated by it. He wasn't there personally, but he got to the point where he could say, if I had been a Hutu back then, with all the Hutus went through, I probably would have participated. I mean, that shows the epitome of being able to project into the life situation of the other. And so the book represents not just getting a message and putting it through a funnel and saying, oh, do you get it? The book is about this human journey of trying to get it in terms of our self-understanding and our understanding of the other. Because that's at the heart of it. It's relationships. And relationships that have been really, really broken. And whether we own up to it or not, we have difficult situations in our own background, in our own ancestry, and in our own lives. And we have contributed to difficult situations for other people. So if we want to understand all of those dynamics, we have to try to get a grasp of what really happens when all of this hell is breaking loose, when people do terrible things. So I was prompted to start this journey by an observation made in about 1983 when I was up in Thompson, when Henry Rempel, an economist, came up to give a talk to our peace group, and he mentioned that behind the Ethiopian famine, where thousands were dying at the time, was a conflict, and food was used as a weapon. And so something clicked within me, and I figured, I want to understand how humans can do this. How can they consciously, deliberately withhold food from starving people so that so many people die? And I really wanted to do my homework, because the answer is not a simple or straightforward one. And so the book itself then represents a journey of discovering answers to a series of questions, one of which leads to the next one. So the first question is, what motivates people? What is deep-rooted conflict? And what is an essential motivating impulse, if you like? And I think it's very evident that when people commit these kinds of atrocities, there's a deep emotion associated with it. And so I built on the work of John W. Burton, who was a prolific writer and a leader in the field of conflict studies, whose understanding was turned upside down in the 1970s when he came across the work of Paul Seitz, who was an outstanding theorist in human needs. And all of a sudden, John put the two together, the study of conflict and the study of human identity needs, and came up with this observation: when the non-material, non-negotiable identity needs are threatened, people will fight. Or putting it another way, in a way that Paul Seitz put it in the book Conflict Human Needs Theory, he looked at the analogs between emotions and human needs. And so you could say, when the core identity needs for meaning, connectedness, action, recognition, and connectedness, when these are threatened, there will be an emotional reaction. You will feel it. You'll feel it in your gut. And your inclination is going to be to do something. And, we know about these inclinations to flee, fight, or fawn, or freeze. But these are just manifestations of this convulsion, I guess, of emotions within oneself. And so if we start to unpack what this is about, and if you use the insights, if you like, from Lonergan and insight mediation, where they say, what do you really care about and what really threatens you? It's another way of looking at it. Well, we care about connections, about who's close to us, about who our family is, who our friends are. We care about finding meaning and finding justice. We care about being able to do things, especially things that we imagine to be worthwhile in life. We care about recognition, and we care about safety and security. And you could see the other side of that. We are threatened if somebody pulls the rug out from under our meaning system or does something that is unjust. We're threatened if somebody who we're close to either turns on us or is taken away from us or is harmed or we lose a relationship. We feel threatened if something is attacking our sense of security, whether it's physical security, emotional security, spiritual security. We're threatened if somebody gives us negative recognition, if somebody pokes fun at us, or somebody laughs at us, or if somebody destroys our argument, or if somebody completely discredits our perspective. And we're threatened as well if all of a sudden we're stymied and we can't take action, if we're tied up, or if somebody uses the law or a policy to keep us from thriving or doing things that are important to us. So there are cares and threats that can be deconstructed, if you like, if you use the various identity needs to look at that. So we can say, okay, the first step is people could be drawn into deep-rooted conflict if something is out there that is a threat to their identity. And this can be a real threat, or it can be a construed threat, but if people believe it's a threat. So there are demagogues, there are leaders who are narcissistic, who build up a worldview that is just about them and their people, and they can frame certain people as a threat. So this is what Hitler did with regard to the Jews. He didn't just say, kill the Jews. He said, the Jews are a threat. And he had all sorts of reasons, most of them not based on anything true, but he was able to build up a worldview that would construe them as such. And that built up the kinds of emotions that then allowed him to do the monstrous and terrible things that he did. But there was a threat, that people believed in, and that he continued to emphasize in his rhetoric. And you find this in politicians today, some of whom will use negative speech to build up a scapegoat, to channel the anger and the frustration of people toward some kind of violence or negativity. So the next big question then is, how do these emotions get fueled and intensified? And there we look to the mimetic theory of another giant, and intellectual giant, is René Girard, who said, what really drives so much of what we do is desire. And you can start then thinking about desire in the realm of meaning, desire in the realm of recognition, desire in the realm of relationships, and things and sources of security, and then put money into the equation, because money itself can be an identity need satisfier if people tie their identity to money. And how does the desire then get intensified? Well, he said, we imitate the desires of others. We want what others have. And more than that, if somebody seems to be happy with what they have, we want the joy and happiness and fulfillment that they seem to exude. So you bring mimetic theory into this, and you start to see how rivalries develop, how people mutually desire what the other one has, And it gets to the point, in Girard's terms, of doubling, where people are obsessed, absolutely obsessed with somebody else or with another party or with another group. And they feel inferior if the other gets ahead, and they feel they feel almost like a god in Girard's terms if they get ahead of the other. And so you start to have this focus on the other that can move into violence. And as soon as violence is introduced, as Girard said, it's always mimetically repaid, and repaid with interest. So you start to see the dynamism associated with these threats and how they're acted out, and how it's a back and forth kind of rivalry that intensifies. And as Girard points out, there's also the phenomenon of scapegoating, where a community will come together and pour all of its violence together onto a scapegoat. So it's another aspect of this dynamic, and that goes along with what people have said in the political science world: if you want to unite a people, have a good war. Because that's the scapegoat phenomenon. People come together over a common enemy. And you have to acknowledge that that's one of the dynamics that's out there that is intensifying this impulse to do these terrible, atrocious things. And then you take it another step further and say, oh, but it's not just a level playing field out there. Like, some of this violence takes place in situations of really significant disparities in power. And if if one party gets enough power that they can control another, then we have a hegemonic structure, a structure of domination and subjection. And in this kind of situation, if it goes on for a period of time, the people who are subjected will internalize a sense of defeat, of inferiority. They will learn to be in their place, because if they step out of their place, the violent repercussions are so terrible. So this is what happened in colonialism. It's a prime example. If you take slavery, what happened in slavery is that the slaves were physically taken, they were put in shackles, they were kept apart, and they were physically forced to work. I mean, they were whipped if they didn't do the right thing. They were tortured. So they became subjected. There's an economic part to this. They didn't benefit economically from the work they did. And so the whole Southern economy was based on this free labor from slaves. There was a political aspect to it, in that they didn't have any political rights. They had nothing to appeal to. Politically, they were thought of as property. They were totally dehumanized. Then there was language that helped to keep them in place. They were referred to with words that diminished them. And then with those words, they thought to be diminished within themselves and their own identity. And there was a spirit of domination that came through, where the colonial masters came across as though you have to do what I say, or you have to do what I would like you to do. So we see this kind of domination even in Hollywood, where you have these powerful men who had control over the careers of people, who would take advantage of this with women and basically say, if you don't give me what I want, forget it. You're not going to have a career. So there's a use of power then that is wrong and subjects people. And behind this use of power, you have all the things that we've talked about so far. You have people who start to define their identity needs in terms of power over people, or getting more and more power and more recognition. And you have mimetic rivalries. So in the colonial time, you had a rivalry between the colonial powers, England, France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands. Germany participated in this. It had its own colonies in Africa, and Russia was expanding its own empire. And so you have the whole empire meme, if you like, fueling this, and mimetic desire for having greater and greater power. Who can carve up the world, or get the biggest chunk of the world under their control, along with the people that are living on that part of the geography. And so mimetic theory then really helps to explain the dynamics of hegemonic structures. And you start to see that, as Girard points out, the biggest rivalries are between people who identify with one another. So you start to see that there are rivalries between dominant groups of people, but then there are rivalries between subjected people. And part of what the colonial powers did to make use of this phenomenon without being aware of this is how things work, is they used this idea of divide and conquer. So they basically poured fuel on the fire of rivalries between groups that they were trying to dominate. And if they got the different groups fighting with one another, then it was easy for them to maintain control of the whole thing. So the plot is thickening. But then you start to ask the question, how are people constituted? How are identities formed so that groups of people coalesce? And on what basis do they say we are working as a collective to dominate, if you like, in the case of empires, or we are identifying ourselves within our own group of oppressed people? And that's where ethno-nationalism comes in. And the context of my doing this, as I was working on it in the 1980s, leading up to the 1990s, and then through the 1990s, we were starting to have some key theorists in the area of political science, Walker Connors being one of them, Stephen Ryan, another one, who are starting to say that in the field of international relations and political science, people have looked at nations as being self-contained, monolithic, but in reality, they're saying there is really no such thing as a nation state. There may be about 6 examples that have come reasonably close, but in every country in the modern world, there have been subgroups. And the dynamics in relation to these subgroups are really, really powerful. There are minorities who have often been overlooked and neglected, who have deep resentments. There are, and this ethno-nationalist tendency can drive separatist movements. And in certain parts of the world, this is really fierce. I mean, if you think about the Balkans and think about what was driving the ethnic, the conflict in the breakup of former Yugoslavia, well, it was the tension between Croats and Serbs and Bosniaks. And you start to see how people add on boundary markers. And so you have an attention to language and people making a big deal of the smallest changes in language. People in Yugoslavia all understood one another. And now all of a sudden you have people say, oh, I'm speaking Serbian and I'm speaking Croatian. And I remember in Zagreb getting a tour of the city, and the tour guide was pointing out these ancient Croatian words that they were using that were specific to Croatia. Well, they're a minute part of the whole language, but people use the smallest thing to say we're establishing a boundary marker because of this these differences. And so religion then became a tool in making boundary markers so that, you know, the Serbs started to pay attention to being Orthodox, and the Croats to being Catholic, and the Bosniaks to being Muslim. Well, back in the day when it was all Yugoslavia, the Bosniaks didn't dress any differently. They fit right into the whole population. After the whole ethnic cleansing thing, you started to have people going to mosques and to churches, and you started to have some Bosniak women who were Muslim wear distinctive clothing covering their heads. They never ever did that previously. But the whole idea is that as the tensions increase, people start to say who's in and who's out, and they use whatever they can is at their disposal, whether it's little bits of language, whether it's religion, geography, or whatever, to say this is who we are, and this is what sets us apart from the other. And then on that basis, you have command rape, you have massacres of men and boys, you have the destruction of cities. I remember walking the streets of Mostar and seeing building after building that was shelled out, and just walking those streets and seeing that had a depressing effect, just on the basis of these ethno-nationalist distinctives. And so it was coming to the fore, and people were realizing, hey, this is really a significant dynamic in what's going on in the world. And so when you think about ethno-nationalism, then you think about shared common ancestry. You think about, and when the chips are down, some of these theorists say, when the chips are down, to whom do you go? You go to people, a lot of people will go to people with a shared common ancestry. You know, those are the people they can trust. You have ethnicity, including language and food and customs, and these unwritten taboos and patterns and cultural patterns. You have religion, which I've already mentioned. Then you have land, because people associate the nationalist narratives with a piece of land, with territory, and they are particularly emotionally attached to that. And then you have politics, and the difference between ethnoculturalism is a celebration of different cultures, but it becomes ethno-nationalist when you put in land and politics, because then the impulse is for a particular group to control its own land. And then another twist on all of this is aboriginality, because if you were the first peoples on a part of land, then a big part of your identity is linked to the sense of this is where our ancestors have been for a very long time. And probably one of the oldest places is Australia, where the Aboriginal people go back 60,000 years. But then you want to say, okay, so you have these groups, ethno-nationalism, and we can now say that the same phenomena around ethno-nationalist groups has been taken over by other ways of people defining themselves. So there can be deep values, for instance, that bring people together, like being part of the environmental movement, for instance, or being committed to a kind of lifestyle, or being part of a particular political ideology. And you can see the same kind of identity markers and groups occurring within sub-communities. So if you take the community of people who have hearing problems, you have the culturally deaf who have never heard anything. They were born deaf. You have the people who became deaf, and there's a big difference between those two groups. You have the people who are hearing impaired and severely hearing impaired and so on. So there are subgroups between them. Right now, you have the queer community, which has these subgroups. And so there are divisions between gay men, lesbian women, gender fluid, the trans community, the people who have, and so on. And so you have these divisions based on identity distinctions. And when a group is oppressed, then sometimes these become magnified. But we have this tendency among humans, and the whole mimetic theory then says, if another group is getting something better than we, then, we'll have mimetic desire for that. We'll have a basis for rivalry. Indigenous people have told me that their biggest conflicts are not with settler society. Their biggest conflicts are with other indigenous groups. And it makes sense. It makes perfect sense when you start seeing how this phenomenon works and how people have these mimetic rivalries between people that they somehow identify with. And that's why family conflicts are so intense, because people relate to one another as being part of the same family. And then to take a step further, you could say, okay, what happens with all of this conflict, and how does one violence instigate the next? And so you start looking at the dynamics of victimization, and you start to look at how people experience PTSD, how they're traumatized, how there's an invisible woundedness associated with it, and then how this trauma and woundedness gets turned into ethno-narratives, where every ethnic group has its own chosen glories, in Van McVolken's terms, and chosen traumas. And so they start saying, we need to have this negative attitude toward the others because what they did 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 600 years ago, 1,000 years ago. So for Muslim people right now, the Crusades are still a living memory for them from 1,000 years ago. When Milosevic wanted to rally the Serbian people, he had the remains of Lazar paraded through the streets, and Lazar was the Serbian hero in the Battle of Kosovo of 1389. So 600 years later, in 1989, people were weeping about Lazar, who had died 600 years previously. So there are these deep traumas, and then when you have two traumatized peoples that are at enmity, and when you're traumatized and have PTSD, you have involuntary emotional reactions. So we go right back to the beginning to identity needs and the role of emotions, and how a trigger can release a whole reservoir of recollection and bring back a sense of what happened in the past. And this becomes intergenerational. And so, so you can have wounded people that are up against another wounded people for whom there is an involuntary emotional reaction at the slightest thing that goes wrong. And when there's an intense involuntary emotional reaction, we're deprived of our capacity to take a step back, to get on the balcony and look at the situation and say, what's really going on here? Why are the other people feeling like that? We are just right in there with our own feelings, and we can't get out. So we can look at all of these dynamics, and then with all of this, we can throw in gender, sexuality and gender, and then we can start to see patriarchy as a hegemonic structure, and the same tools of analysis go into that, and you start to see how men have been in rivalry with men, and women have been in rivalry with women because they've identified with one another. And now that we're starting to work for equality in a marriage situation, all of a sudden you've got a whole new possibility of there being rivalries between men and women, who now, as women can do everything, you start to have another level of potential rivalry, because as long as women had one role and men had another role, they weren't in rivalry with one another. So we start to unlock dynamics that we are going through, and we can see them with new eyes. We can understand why and how these things are happening. And so when I'm invited to be on a journey with Indigenous people and talk about lateral violence, one of my messages is that because of the systemic oppression of colonialism, because of being stuck on reserves, which are closed systems, because all the conditions are there to magnify all the things that I'm talking about in terms of rivalries and scapegoating, the message is anybody in that situation is going to experience a tendency toward lateral violence. It's nothing about any people in particular. You start to see how there are systemic things that contribute to this. And so at one point, as I was writing the book and I was looking at the Okaganisatagi crisis, and I had read about these pacifist Indigenous women who were saying the guns were necessary. So why would these pacifist women be saying the guns were necessary? So when I read that, I had this aha moment, if you like, that made me realize that a deep-rooted conflict is far bigger than any individuals. And we can be caught in something that goes beyond who we are as individuals, but that just takes us along. It's like when you're caught in an undertow in an ocean, you can't do anything about it. You're moved with that force that is so much bigger than you. And so I called this something a mimetic structure of violence. And the mimetic structure of violence combines all the things that we've been talking about. It operates at an individual level and at a collective level. It's mimetic in that it's reciprocal, and people are always reacting to what the other is doing or saying or experiencing. It's a structure in that it's a pattern, and it's a diachronic, meaning that it goes through time. So it has a history to it, and it has a future projection to it. And it's violent in that it is about getting ahead at the expense of others or getting back at others. It includes revenge, harming the other or fearing of being harmed by another. And so when I ask where do you find a mimetic structure of violence? Well, it's found within a relational system. And relational has to do with people interacting with one another, and system means that people are brought into contact with one another somehow or other. So it can be big as the rivalry between two superpowers, or it could be an individual relational system. And so when we think about how do we transform the situation, we have to think about how do we transform a mimetic structure of violence. That can include these ethno-narratives, it can include the boundary markers, it includes the memory of past hurts and woundedness. And as soon as I thought about that, I figured there has to be something more. And so what is there besides mimetic structures of violence? And I said, there are mimetic structures of, and my first impulse was to say peace. But then I thought, peace has the connotation of something almost boring, like pacifistic or things just being tranquil. And if we want to think about what takes the place of violence in a compelling way, it has to be something dynamic and creative and producing new things. It has to be contributing to growth, excitement. And so having a background in Hebrew Bible, I thought of the word berakah in Hebrew, and the word berakah is translated blessing. And so I thought, oh, there may be for some people, blessing has a really religious connotation and might be off-putting. So I weighed that all, but I thought, I can't think of another word that combines all of these things that I was talking about, the flourishing creativity and well-being and dynamism. I can't think of another word that captures that as well as blessing, especially if I remind people of the Hebrew roots of the concept and what I'm talking about. So when I discovered that, then I had to start thinking about what constitutes blessing and go back to all of these categories that I had used at the beginning of the book to understand violence, to say, how can we then understand relationships that are mutually productive and mutually enhancing? And so there was a story that gave overall meaning to this about somebody who went into their afterlife, and they went into hell first. And here were these starving people complaining, very disgruntled and very unhappy. And in front of them were these tables of food. And they couldn't get the food into their mouths because they had long forks, longer than their arms. So they just couldn't get food into their mouths. And so they were frustrated. They then went to heaven, and here you had the same long forks, you had the same tables of food, but people were happy, laughing, and getting on well and having a great time. And the difference was that they were feeding each other. So you start to see the difference between violence and blessing is how we've programmed our minds and our hearts and our attitudes, and how that is translated into certain kinds of actions and relationships. So the question then is, how do we get from the animosity and hurt to people feeding one another in some way? And just to look at it briefly through the lens of these different theoretical constructs, then within mimetic structure, when we think about human identity needs, people start to feel like my identity need for meaning is met when the other has meaning. My need for justice is met when I see justice for the other person. My need for connectedness is met when I can be a friend to the other. My security comes through the other feeling secure. My recognition is more complete when the other is recognized as well. And I start to realize that recognition doesn't cost anything. So if I could give lots of recognition and honor people and weave that into my lifestyle, then that's part of this mimetic structure of blessing. My action then is complete when the other has a capacity for action. So when we look at it in terms of mimetic theory, I became enabled through the work of Rebecca Adams, and I gave Rebecca Adams a number of pages in here to explain loving mimesis. And she had this breakthrough in 1995, which was right when I was writing my thesis, in 1995, where she was working with the ideas of René Girard, and she said, and she had interviewed Girard, and I think in 1993, in a really famous interview where Girard said, you know, mimetic desire is not bad. It doesn't have to be associated with violence. It's basically good, except he hadn't really pursued how it can be good. And so she had her own breakthrough experience where she started to see if you have a self who is imitating a model, and if the model desires the well-being of the self, so in your case, suppose I'm a wounded subject, or I'm a proto-subject, or there's something not complete, but I'm looking up to you. And I can see, and through what you say and what you do, I can see that you really desire my well-being. If I imitate your desire, imitating your desire means that I start to have enough self-respect that I can think that my own well-being is something worthwhile. So your desiring my well-being works mimetically to give me the capacity to start getting out of my state of woundedness, if you like. And just to fast forward, I'm now part of a loving mimesis group with Rebecca Adams herself, and with Julia Robinson Moore, who is an African-American theologian, and Felicity McCallum, who is an Aboriginal elder working with mimetic theory in Australia. And we are currently really trying to work out the dynamics of loving mimesis. What does that really mean? And it has its own complexity to it. So we want to think about mimetic structures of blessing then in terms of when we think about scapegoating, it has everybody coming together around a scapegoat victim. But when I worked with Bob Berta on community-based conflict resolution, one of the principles that he suggested for community-based conflict resolution is gathering everybody together around a positive-centered event. So this becomes a blessing. People are gathered together around something positive, and you put something positive in the middle that they can rally around. Then when we look at hegemonic structures, we start to say that if we really want mimetic structures of blessing, we have to do everything we can to dismantle hegemonic structures, to dismantle these structures of control. And a current thing for me, and this is part of the reason I need to do a second edition, because I have these new insights, but right now, I'm starting to see that what is bad for humankind are three memes. The meme of empire and the idea of expanding control and getting domination is bad for humankind. Whether that is old style empires and rebuilding old style empires, or whether that is an economic empire, a monopoly, a social media empire, but empire, the meme of empire and that empires are desirable has to be dismantled somehow or other. Grandiose leaders, the meme of great people being the ones who dominate, that too has to be dismantled, because that's not good for humankind. We don't need leaders who are going to lord it over people. We don't need grandiose leaders, and we should call no one great just because they have conquered people and established control over other people. We have to change that meme and the meme of self-interest. And the meme of self-interest is in economic life. A lot of entrepreneurs say, it's my duty to work out of self-interest, to do the best I can just for myself. In international relations, self-interest is there as a dominant meme. And individually, a lot of people are saying, nobody else is going to look out for me, so I have to do it myself. And that's very destructive. And we can look at the roots and how this all came through via Darwin and Adam, or misreading of Adam Smith and so on. But nonetheless, these memes are out there, and they all work together to cultivate these domination systems that have to be dismantled. And then when we think of ethno-nationalism, we start to say, how can I expand my own sense of identity so that instead of it being bounded by my common ancestry, ethnicity, religion, and so on, can't I expand my identity tent so I'm linked with other people? And so from myself, I can say, I am honored to have been invited into the circle of Indigenous people. And in certain respects, I see myself as being Indigenous on the inside, because I have adopted so many values and practices and teachings from Indigenous people. And likewise with other people. I was part of a Muslim-Christian dialogue and a Jewish-Christian dialogue for over 20 years. And I've incorporated insights and understanding and love and compassion for people from those communities. I've had so much to do with Africans. And so when I see an African, I can say, I have really journeyed with folks from your continent. And so I feel a sense of affinity. And then as a feminist man, I can say I feel in solidarity with women. So we can say we can honor our own ancestral journey, if you like, and our own ancestors, but not limit ourselves to that as an identity. And so I've experienced this transcending of boundaries, and I was really moved back in my university days. I had come from a background where I had been super religious, and at a certain point I gave up on that, and I went through a crisis where I had to let go of a whole lot of deep beliefs that I had, and it took me almost to the end of my life. But I went through that, and I had this friend, it was the son of the rabbi actually, who was taking drugs, and he was with one of his drug-taking friends who was kind of ridiculing me because I had never been high on drugs. And this friend of mine stuck up for me, and he said, what Vern went through is as deep and profound as what we've experienced through drugs. And him transcending that us versus them, drug takers versus non-drug takers, if you like, and feeling a sense of solidarity at a deep human level, was really profound. It had to do with getting past identity markers that set us apart from one another. And then when you think about the psychodynamics of victimization, you can start to say, if we really desire the well-being of the other, then we really desire the healing from trauma and intergenerational trauma, and we do everything in our power to say and do things. And sometimes that means absorbing. When you're close to somebody who has PTSD, they could very well say things that, if you take them seriously, you find them hurtful, because they're said in a tone of voice with heavy emotion and all that. And so part of the healing is learning to just say, I'm going to let go of my own ego in this and just not let it bother me. and try to walk the path constructively. It's a hard thing to do because one can easily get into a paternalistic kind of mentality where you're doing too much for the other. But part of it is just that letting go of your own reactions to certain things that you might at first blush find difficult. So one of the subtexts in all that I'm talking about is that I have been trying to find a discursive field to talk about these things, to talk about reconciliation and so on, that anybody can relate to. I can make connections between some of these concepts in my own faith tradition in certain ways, but I can talk about these things without that. And so I'm trying to think of an example now of how that is the case, but you can think about mimetic structures of violence as being similar to the conceptualization of Satan or the devil. And Jesus talked about how, and if you think about the idea of devil as a personification of something big and abstract, but when Jesus says the devil is a murderer and a liar, you can see that mimetic desire in its negative violent form is all about deception. You try to present yourself as happier than you might really be. You're acting something out. So there's a lot of deception that goes on. So it's a liar. And ultimately it's going toward death. It's like a murderer. So there are these analogical aspects that it can be mutually enlightening, if you like, if you start making those kinds of connections. You can say mimetic structures of blessing are similar to what has been characterized as the Holy Spirit, but they're similar to the positive energy field that you tap into, that you experience with. If you're a Christian, you might say, well, I'm experiencing something and I call it the Holy Spirit, but other people can also tap into this same very positive field. But what's interesting and instructive is that when the Apostle Paul said, or Jesus says repeatedly, by their fruits you will know them. So you use the metaphor of fruit and you can say, how do you know what somebody really is? Well, what's the fruit of their action? What are they doing? What are they accomplishing? And so when Paul says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, kindness, and so on, these qualities map on almost identically to the 7 pillars of Indigenous teaching, where they talk about love and compassion and kindness and honesty and truth and so on. And you could go the other way and you could say, hey, Apostle Paul, the fruit of the Spirit is, and you could list the 7 virtues from Indigenous teaching. Everybody agrees. And at the end of him saying this, Paul says, there's no law against these things. Nobody's going to quarrel with these things. And so that then leads to a concept that I have developed that's central, and I talk about it in From Violence to Blessing, but I've written an enormous amount since that time, but it has to do with teachings of blessing. So you can say, what is going to help make reconciliation possible? And we can start to see that reconciliation could be thought of as the transformation of mimetic structures of violence to mimetic structures of blessing. And this involves getting out of the violence. It's a freedom from the violence and a freedom to explore blessing. So you have the negative and the positive aspects of that transformation. And so that maps onto some original work that I did on the concept of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible, where the Exodus was the freedom from slavery, which was a mimetic structure of violence, and the freedom to enter the promised land, which from the point of view of the ancient Hebrew people was deeply associated with blessing for them. One could ask the question, but what about the Canaanites? But I mean, that's another complicating factor. One person's blessing. But nonetheless, let's look at that aspect of it, a freedom from slavery, a freedom to enter the promised land. And there's 40 years in between. What happened in between was that Moses was teaching the people. The word Torah, which often is taken to mean the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, comes from the Hebrew word yara, which is to teach. So it's really instruction. So they were given the Torah, they were given instructions, and they were given instructions that would help them escape the mimetic structures of violence that they had in Egypt, and particularly slavery. So at the core of the teachings were the 10 Commandments. And one of the commandments is remember the Sabbath, 7th day, you should rest. But what do you do on the Sabbath? And what's important from our perspective is that in the Exodus version, it says, make sure that everybody rests. Your animals rest, your slaves rest, your slaves. Well, they're people too. They have rights, and they are to rest in the same way as you. So it limits slavery in that there's a day of rest. But in the Deuteronomic version of the 10 Commandments, it says, on the 7th day, you exercise a hermeneutics of memory. You remember that you were slaves. You remember what it was like to be a slave. If you really remember what it's like to be a slave, that should have implications for how you treat your fellow person. And then there are Sabbath teachings that say every 7 years, you have to let your slaves go free. So you're limiting the hegemonic structure of slavery. You have systemic limits to that. And that raises the question then, if we really want to have mimetic structures of blessing that become systematic, we have to have rules and laws that and actions that do that. So just a week or two ago, I was in Richmond and I went to the Museum of the Civil War. And there they had a display that said, there are places around the world where there are still slaves. And if you think about slavery being forcing people to do things against their will in a consistent way, there are 400,000 such people in the United States. When you think about human trafficking, when you think about forced prostitution, and you think about people in labor situations where they're, in a sense, extorted to be there. If they don't have the right papers, then they could be turned in if they don't stay with you and work for a small wage, and so on. So we're not free of even things as basic as slavery in our world. So we have to think, and if we go back to that, periodically there's a release of slaves. What would happen if there was a year in which everybody would be set free, every migrant, if we stopped the clock on a given day and said every migrant who is in any place has full citizenship wherever they are at that moment, and the slate is clean. Just suppose we were to do things like that, or suppose the International Monetary Fund would periodically cancel the debt of all of the struggling countries. So reconciliation you start to see is not just the feeling of, oh, I forgive you and I establish relationships with you, or I apologize and so on. As good as those things are and as transformative as they might be, but it also involves making structural and symbolic and systemic changes that will result in the full well-being and flourishing of people. And so that's my overview of From Violence to Blessing.
Wonderful, wonderful. I mean, the transition from violence to blessing can be challenging, as you just said, and obviously it also requires sacrifice, right? As you just said, economic, for example. What coping mechanism or mindset shifts does the book suggest for those going through such a process?
Well, at this point, it's hard for me to answer what is exactly in the book, because it's been a while since, it's been over 20 years since it was released. And I started reading it again today in preparation for it, but I didn't make it right through. But in terms of coping mechanisms, I know it's insights that I had back then, but one of them is that we need each other. And for people who are doing frontline work with the most difficult and challenging situations, an individual case, and I say this having done a lot of work in penitentiaries at one time, an individual case is like a black hole for energy. Like, it can be all consuming, and you can give and give of yourself, and it's still not enough. So people who are engaged in that need other people. They need support. They need other people to affirm them. They need people to say, you have to put some boundaries up. You need some limits. You need to look after yourself. So we need each other for support. We need to, I guess, give recognition and tell the stories of other people. And I've tried to do some of that. And one of the books that I worked on, I'll just get it. Is this one. And on the cover, you have these two Rwandans. Alphonse is the man, and Teteri is the woman. And Alphonse killed the mother, brother, and little sister of Teteri during the genocide. They had a chance to meet through a program that was fostered by friends of mine, Pierre and Judy Allard, of restorative justice, which provides a structure for victim survivors to meet with perpetrators of the genocide. And in their case, they were reconciled, and Teteri forgave Alphonse. And Alphonse is like a son to her now, and he helps her in the garden. And every day there's sort of a murmuring ripple as he walks through the village, and everybody knows who he is and what he did as he goes to her place. So by putting their picture here on the cover, I'm paying tribute to them for having reconciled as they did, and to Pierre and Judy and the chaplains in the Rwandan prison system who are setting up the structures to make that kind of reconciliation possible. And your final question is, what makes me feel alive? What makes me feel alive is when I can tell the story of somebody else who's done something remarkable like this. What makes me feel alive is if I can give recognition to somebody in such a way that it starts a spark, and people say, I hadn't thought of myself that way, or they're struggling, and all of a sudden you see tears of relief and joy because they start to realize, yes, I have gone through something difficult and I'm making it and I'm coping, and there's something good going on. Or if I can connect people such that there is really a mimetic structure of blessing that happens, that they feed one another. Or in my teaching, the best for me is when we go around at the end of the final class and people are talking about how much they learned from all the other students, so that I could set up a context whereby people could really feed one another. So it wasn't about me. So anyway, that and all of these then these kinds of attitudes and actions are ones that will contribute to resilience and growth. And as you do that, you always have to be cautious that you not become paternalistic, you not become somebody with all the answers. It takes a constant checking in and sensitivity to who is taking action. So it's always about honoring the action of others. So I feel really honored when I am invited to share something, as you have invited me today to share something. And if I'm invited to an Indigenous community, they are taking action and I'm responding to their invitation, and honored to be part of the journey. And so, I started out by saying I see the book as something that pays tribute to the giants who have contributed to my understanding, from John W. Burton to Rebecca Adams to René Girard to Walker Connors to so many. And I'm paying tribute to the people who have engaged with me about their own experience of violent, deep-rooted conflict and reconciliation. I have within the book, I have the story of how Richard Batsanduka went to Rwanda and went to the prison where he met with a person who killed his brother and forgave his brother. So as I if I give a space to others to share stuff, that starts to become the significant thing. And that's why I don't want to be construed as the guru or whatever. I want to be just considered a fellow human being who's engaged in looking at these questions together with others to find our best understanding and our best way forward.
Yeah, so profound, Vern. It's truly beautiful, and you living that you are building this mimetic structure of a blessing. I can truly tell and testify what I have been through, in one of the introductory lectures, courses in Introduction to Conflict Studies, and how profound this shaped my personal journey and really all of my peers, because there what we witnessed was really turning a university lecture. Ultimately, it became truly transforming, already after a few courses, like people, they were able to share so profound, stories about their life and others, which I personally have never witnessed before and since. So that's how profound it is, and that's why I'm so blessed to have with you those kind of conversation and to continue really to study your work and help to get something that is truly meaningful and transformative. That's it's very profound, and just as you mentioned, these stories, how you're able to relate to it and find your place within those stories, and that you are able to provide such a space is tremendous. Simply the fact to also gain this trust of Indigenous people, of people all over the world who went through the most horrific experiences that we can imagine, and that's the thing, we can't even imagine. It is so horrendous, what people have been through. So thank you so much for continuing being an inspiration. I think that's truly what we need, and by setting this example, you really paved the way for myself, but also for so many friends of mine, to truly embark of a transformative journey that I think we all hope for, to become more loving, more genuine, more peaceful. That's why knowledge matters. Thank you. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.e-ykm.com.